Sometimes the most terrifying word in wartime is not a bomb or a gunshot, but a simple order that no one explains. Oklahoma, summer of 1944. The land around the small prisoner camp stretched wide and flat beneath a sky that seemed too large for the earth. Wheat fields shimmered in the distance like pale gold waves, and the hot wind carried the dry smell of dust and sun-baked soil across the rows of wooden barracks. Cicadas screamed from the cottonwood trees along the fence line, their steady buzz rising and falling like the hum of an engine that never turned off. Inside Barracks 3, a group of German women prisoners sat quietly on narrow wooden bunks, their gray uniforms faded by months of work and sunlight. Some were nurses captured in North Africa. Others had worked as radio operators or clerks before the war swept them into uniforms and then into captivity. They had crossed an ocean in crowded transport ships, ridden trains through towns they could not name, and finally arrived here in the middle of Oklahoma, a place so far from home it felt almost unreal. Among them sat 27-year-old Anna Weber, her blonde hair tied back in a simple knot, her posture straight even while resting against the wooden wall behind her bunk. Before the war, she had been a nursing student in Hamburg, the daughter of a quiet baker who believed that patience and kindness were the two most important virtues a person could learn. War had taken that quiet life away piece by piece. First the bombing raids, then the hospitals filled with wounded soldiers, then capture in Tunisia when the front collapsed, and now this camp surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, somewhere in a country she had only seen on maps. The loudspeaker crackled suddenly outside the barracks, a burst of static cutting through the afternoon heat. Conversation stopped instantly. Every woman in the room turned toward the open window where the sound drifted in. A calm American voice followed, steady and matter-of-fact. German prisoners report to the bathhouse building. Repeat, prisoners report to the bathhouse. The message echoed across the compound, bouncing lightly off the wooden structures before fading into the open fields beyond the fence. No one moved. For several seconds the room remained perfectly still, as if the women had turned into statues carved from pale stone. Then someone, near the door, whispered one word in German. Showers. The word moved through the room like a ripple in still water. Showers. A simple word. A normal word. But in wartime Europe it had taken on a different meaning, one whispered in frightened conversations and half-believed rumors that traveled from camp to camp across a continent at war. Anna felt the muscles in her shoulders tighten without realizing it. She looked across the room at Lena Vogel, a thin 19-year-old former telephone operator from Munich who had become her closest friend during the long months of captivity. Lena's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Her knuckles had turned white. Did you hear it too? Lena asked quietly in German. Anna nodded once. The room had grown warmer, though the temperature had not changed. Outside, the cicadas continued their relentless song. Another woman stood slowly from her bunk and walked to the window, peering across the dusty compound. The bathhouse building sat near the center of the camp, a long wooden structure with a metal roof that reflected the sun like a sheet of polished silver. Thin trails of steam drifted lazily from the vents along the roofline, curling upward into the hot Oklahoma air. Anna had seen the building many times while walking to work details in the fields beyond the fence. She had never thought much about it. It was simply another building in the camp, another piece of the daily routine that defined their lives here. But now the sight of it felt different somehow. Heavier. The loudspeaker crackled again. All German female prisoners report to the bathhouse immediately. A few of the women exchanged uneasy glances. One older nurse named Marta Keller crossed herself quietly, her lips moving in a silent prayer. The camp itself did not look threatening. In fact, it often seemed strangely ordinary compared to the destruction they had left behind in Europe. The guards in the watchtowers leaned lazily against wooden railings, rifles resting across their shoulders as they scanned the compound with bored expressions. Beyond the fences, the Oklahoma countryside rolled away in peaceful green hills dotted with farms and windmills. Sometimes cattle could be seen grazing in the distance, dark shapes moving slowly across the grass. It was a peaceful landscape, the kind people might choose for a quiet life far from the chaos of war. But inside the barracks, the tension had begun to grow. What if? Lena started to say, then stopped herself. Anna understood the unfinished thought without hearing the words. During their long journey from Europe, they had heard stories from other prisoners. Stories about camps, about buildings where people were told they would shower. Stories that most people dismissed because they seemed too terrible to believe completely. But rumors have a strange power during wartime. Even the ones that sound impossible have a way of planting small seeds of fear in the mind. Anna stood slowly from her bunk. Her movements were calm, controlled, the same way she had moved through crowded hospital wards during air raids back home. She had learned long ago that panic rarely solved anything. "We should go," she said quietly to Lena. Outside the barracks door, the sunlight hit them like a wave of heat. The ground beneath their boots was packed red dirt that crunched softly with each step. Other women were already walking toward the center of the compound, their shadows stretching long and thin across the dusty yard. The bathhouse door stood open. Steam drifted through the doorway and dissolved in the bright afternoon light. A young American guard stood beside the entrance holding a clipboard, his uniform sleeves rolled up against the heat. He looked barely older than 20. His expression was neutral, almost bored, as he checked names against the list. From a distance the scene appeared perfectly routine. Prisoners walking across a yard. A guard checking paperwork. A building waiting with running water inside. Yet as Anna and Lena joined the slowly forming line outside the bathhouse, something inside Anna's chest tightened again. The women ahead of them stood silently, their eyes fixed on the open doorway. No one spoke now. Even the cicadas seemed quieter for a moment, their endless chorus fading into the background of the afternoon. Somewhere across the compound a truck engine started briefly, then shut off again. The guard by the door looked up from his clipboard and gestured toward the entrance. "5 at a time," he said in simple English. The first group of women stepped forward hesitantly. Anna watched them disappear through the doorway, their figures swallowed by the soft cloud of steam drifting from inside the building. For several seconds nothing happened. The line remained still. The Oklahoma wind moved gently across the yard, stirring dust along the ground. Then somewhere near the middle of the line a quiet sob broke the silence. One of the younger prisoners covered her face with both hands as her shoulders began to shake. No one tried to stop her. No one told her she was wrong to be afraid. Because at that moment every woman standing outside the bathhouse felt the same question moving silently through her mind. What if the rumors had been true all along? The woman who had begun crying did not stop. Her shoulders shook quietly as she tried to cover her face with both hands, as if hiding from the open sky might somehow make the moment disappear. The line of prisoners shifted slightly, but no one stepped away from her. No one told her to be calm. Fear had a way of spreading silently between people who had survived the same war. Anna Weber felt Lena Vogel's fingers tighten around her sleeve. The younger woman was trembling now, her breathing shallow and uneven. "Anna," Lena whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind moving across the yard. "What if it is true?" Anna did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the bathhouse door where the first group of women had disappeared only moments earlier. Steam drifted lazily out into the sunlight, rising and fading like pale ghosts in the warm Oklahoma air. The building itself looked simple and ordinary, built from rough wooden boards painted a dull military brown. A metal pipe ran along the roofline, releasing small bursts of white vapor that curled upward before vanishing into the sky. Everything about the place suggested nothing more than hot water and plumbing. Yet fear does not always listen to logic. Anna had seen enough hospitals during the war to understand how powerful the human imagination could become when people were tired, hungry, and uncertain about what waited for them next. She remembered the crowded field hospital outside Tunis the day before she was captured. The wounded soldiers had filled every bed and every hallway, whispering rumors about the advancing Allied forces. Some believed the Americans were cruel. Others believed they were merciful. No one really knew. Rumors traveled faster than facts in wartime. "It might only be what they say," Anna finally said quietly. "A place to wash." Lena shook her head slightly, her eyes wide with worry. "You heard the stories on the ship," she said. The other prisoners talked about buildings like this. Anna had heard them too. During the long Atlantic crossing, the prisoners had slept in narrow bunks stacked 3 levels high, the air thick with the smell of salt water and engine oil. At night the women whispered to one another in the dim yellow light of the ship's lamps, trading stories about camps in Europe and rumors about what might happen when they reached America. Some of those stories had sounded too terrible to believe completely. But fear has a way of making even the most unlikely stories feel possible. Ahead in the line, the young American guard shifted his weight and checked his watch. He did not look angry or impatient. He looked like a man performing a routine task on a hot afternoon. Sweat darkened the collar of his uniform shirt, and a thin line of dust covered his boots. Anna noticed that his rifle leaned casually against the wall beside the doorway rather than being held tightly in his hands. It was a small detail, but details sometimes reveal more than words. The door opened again. Steam rolled outward in a thicker cloud this time. One of the women who had entered earlier stepped out into the sunlight, holding a folded towel. She paused for a moment as if adjusting to the brightness, then walked slowly toward the barracks without speaking to anyone. Her expression was difficult to read. Not fear, not relief either. Simply quiet and thoughtful, as though she had just completed a long journey and had not yet decided how to describe it. Several women in line leaned forward slightly, trying to study her face for clues. But the woman kept walking until she disappeared behind the nearest building. The guard called the next 5 names from his clipboard. The line moved forward a few steps. Anna and Lena found themselves closer to the doorway now. From this distance, Anna could hear the faint sound of running water inside the building. A steady echo like rain falling on a wooden roof. The sound was ordinary, familiar, but the tension around her continued to build. The young prisoner who had been crying suddenly sank down onto the dusty ground, her legs refusing to hold her upright any longer. 2 other women knelt beside her, speaking softly in German, trying to help her breathe more slowly. The guard looked uncertain for a moment. He glanced toward the watchtower where another soldier leaned against the railing, observing the scene. The soldier in the tower shrugged slightly, offering no instructions. For a few seconds the entire yard seemed to pause. The wind moved through the tall grass beyond the fence, bending the green stalks in slow waves. Somewhere far away a tractor engine droned across the open fields of Oklahoma farmland. The ordinary sounds of rural life continued without interruption. Anna took a slow breath and stepped forward 1 pace. The movement was small but deliberate. Lena looked at her with surprise. "You do not have to go first," Lena whispered quickly. "We can wait." Anna shook her head gently. "Waiting will not change what the building is," she said. Her voice remained calm even though her heart was beating faster than usual. She had learned something important during her months as a nursing student before the war interrupted her life. When people faced uncertainty, someone eventually had to take the first step forward. Otherwise, everyone remained trapped in the same moment of fear forever. The guard glanced up from his list and noticed her standing closer to the door now. His expression softened slightly, as if he recognized the quiet determination in her posture. "Next 5," he repeated, gesturing toward the entrance. Anna felt Lena's hand release her sleeve slowly. The younger woman's eyes were still filled with worry, but she nodded once as if accepting Anna's decision. Together they stepped out of line and moved toward the doorway with 3 other prisoners. The heat inside the building wrapped around them immediately. The air smelled faintly of soap and warm metal pipes. Rows of simple shower heads lined the tiled walls, each one releasing a steady stream of clear water that splashed softly against the floor drains below. The sound filled the room like gentle rain. Anna stood still for a moment, letting the warmth of the steam settle around her shoulders. No guards followed them inside. No doors slammed shut behind them. Only the quiet sound of water running steadily from the pipes above. For the first time since the loudspeaker had announced the order, Anna felt the tight knot in her chest begin to loosen. Behind her, Lena stepped cautiously into the room, staring at the falling water as if trying to understand something that had once seemed impossible. Outside the bathhouse, the wind continued to move across the Oklahoma fields, carrying the scent of sun-warmed grass across the camp as the line of prisoners slowly advanced toward the door. Warm water fell from the metal shower heads in steady silver lines, striking the tiled floor with a soft echo that filled the room like quiet rainfall. For several seconds, Anna Weber simply stood there, watching the water move. The steam drifting through the air blurred the edges of the room, turning the rows of pipes and valves into pale shapes behind a curtain of warmth. The sound was gentle, ordinary, nothing like the terrifying images that had haunted the minds of the prisoners outside only minutes earlier. Lena Vogel stepped forward beside her, her eyes wide as she held one hand beneath the falling water. The stream splashed against her fingers and ran down her wrist. She stared at it, as if expecting something else to happen. Nothing did. Only water. Only warmth. The air smelled faintly of soap and clean metal pipes heated by the sun above the roof. Anna slowly exhaled a breath she did not realize she had been holding. The tension that had built inside her chest since the loudspeaker announcement began to loosen little by little. Around them, the other 3 women who had entered the building with them moved cautiously toward different showerheads. One of them reached out and turned the valve slightly, watching the flow increase as the pipe responded with a soft rattling sound. The water continued running steadily across the tiles and into the floor drains. Lena looked at Anna again, her expression slowly changing from fear to confusion. "It is really just water," she whispered quietly in German. Anna nodded. The words felt almost unnecessary now that the evidence surrounded them in every direction. Yet it still took a few moments for the realization to settle fully into their minds. Fear that had grown quietly for months does not disappear instantly. It dissolves slowly, like morning fog lifting from a field. Outside the bathhouse door, the line of prisoners continued moving forward. The sound of footsteps and murmured voices drifted faintly through the open doorway as the next group prepared to enter. Inside the room, the steam thickened as more shower valves turned open. The building had been designed for efficiency, rather than comfort. Rows of metal pipes ran along the ceiling, feeding identical shower heads spaced evenly across the tiled walls. Each one released a steady column of warm water measured carefully by the camp plumbing system. The simple design served its purpose well. Water flowed. Steam rose. The room filled with the quiet rhythm of running pipes. Anna stepped forward beneath one of the streams and allowed the warm water to touch her hands. The sensation felt almost unfamiliar after months of washing only with cold water from metal basins inside the barracks. She remembered the last time she had stood beneath a real shower before the war changed everything. It had been in her parents' apartment in Hamburg during the summer of 1941. The windows had been open to the sound of bicycles passing along the cobblestone street below. Her father had been baking bread early that morning, filling the kitchen with the smell of warm flour and yeast. That memory felt very far away now, like a photograph from another life. Lena stepped under the neighboring showerhead, hesitating only briefly before letting the water fall across her shoulders. She closed her eyes for a moment as if listening to the quiet rhythm of the drops striking the tile. When she opened them again, there was something different in her expression. Not joy exactly, but relief. A deep and quiet relief that softened the tight lines around her eyes. The other women in the room were beginning to relax as well. One of them laughed softly at the simple discovery that the water temperature could be adjusted by turning the valve another inch. Another woman shook her head in disbelief, wiping steam from her glasses while watching the water swirl toward the drain at her feet. The fear that had followed them into the building seemed to be dissolving with each passing minute. Outside the doorway, Sergeant Daniel Carter stood beside the young guard with the clipboard, observing the scene from the shade of the wooden wall. Carter was 32 years old and had grown up on a small cattle ranch outside Tulsa before joining the Army early in the war. He had seen combat in Europe before being assigned to prisoner management duty here in Oklahoma earlier that year. At first, the assignment had felt strange to him, guarding prisoners instead of facing enemies on. The battlefield required a different kind of patience. But Carter had quickly learned that most of the men and women inside the camp were not very different from the people he had known back home. They were tired, far from home, trying to survive the same war that had carried soldiers across oceans and continents. Carter glanced toward the open doorway where steam drifted into the sunlight. From inside, he could hear the steady echo of water striking tile and the faint sound of voices speaking German. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Just the ordinary sounds of people washing away the dust of a long summer afternoon. The young guard beside him shifted his weight and wiped sweat from his forehead. "They seemed scared earlier," the guard said quietly. Carter nodded. "A lot of people are these days," he replied. His voice carried the calm tone of someone who had spent enough time around war to understand how easily fear could grow in uncertain places. Carter had heard the same rumors that circulated among prisoners arriving from Europe. Stories about camps. Stories about buildings with showers that were not truly showers. Most of those rumors had traveled across the ocean long before the prisoners themselves arrived in America. The problem with rumors was that once they took root in the human mind, they could remain there even when reality proved otherwise. Carter watched as another group of women stepped cautiously through the bathhouse doorway. Their shoulders were tense at first, their movements slow and uncertain. But within a minute or two the tension began to ease as they saw the water falling from the pipes and the steam rising peacefully around them. Carter folded his arms and leaned lightly against the wall. The Oklahoma sun had begun to sink lower in the sky now, turning the open fields beyond the fence a softer shade of gold. In another hour the evening breeze would arrive from the west, cooling the air and carrying the smell of fresh-cut grass from nearby farms. Inside the bathhouse, Anna turned her face slightly upward and allowed the warm water to run across her hair. The simple comfort of it felt almost unreal after so many months of uncertainty. Around her the other women were speaking more freely now, their voices calm again as the last traces of fear faded from the room. Outside the open door the line of prisoners continued moving forward steadily beneath the wide Oklahoma sky. The warmth of the water slowly faded as the pipes began to quiet one by one. The steady streams that had filled the room only minutes earlier softened into lighter flows as several of the women reached up to close the valves. Steam still drifted through the air, but the thick white cloud was beginning to thin, revealing the tiled walls and metal fixtures with clearer detail. Anna Weber stepped back from the showerhead and pushed damp strands of hair away from her face. The sensation of clean water running over her skin had awakened memories she had nearly forgotten. For months the routine inside the camp had been simple and repetitive. Work details in the fields beyond the fence. Meals served at the same hours each day. Cold water from metal basins inside the barracks for washing when time allowed. Nothing luxurious. Nothing comfortable. Just enough to maintain order. This moment felt different. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it reminded her of something ordinary that war had quietly removed from everyday life. Lena Vogel stood beside her wringing water from the edge of a small camp-issued towel. Her shoulders had relaxed now, the earlier fear replaced by an expression of thoughtful calm. "I feel foolish," Lena said softly in German. Her voice carried a mixture of embarrassment and relief. Anna shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "Fear is not foolish when people do not know the truth." Around them the other women were finishing their showers as well. The sound of water striking tile was fading gradually as the valves closed. A few prisoners spoke quietly to one another while drying their hands and faces with the thin towels stacked on a wooden bench near the wall. One older nurse named Marta Keller let out a long breath and smiled faintly for the first time that afternoon. "Warm water," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I had forgotten how simple that can be." The room continued to cool as the steam slowly lifted toward the ceiling vents. Anna walked toward the doorway where the sunlight streamed through the open entrance in a bright rectangle across the floor. Outside she could see the dusty yard and the long line of prisoners still waiting beneath the Oklahoma sky. Some of the women farther back in line stood on their toes trying to glimpse what was happening inside the building. Their faces still carried traces of uncertainty. Anna paused for a moment near the door. The afternoon sunlight felt warm against her damp hair as a gentle breeze moved through the open space. The air outside smelled faintly of grass and dry earth. Beyond the fence the wide Oklahoma fields stretched toward the horizon in quiet shades of green and gold. She stepped outside slowly. Several women near the front of the line turned immediately toward her, searching her expression for any sign of what they might expect. For a brief moment no one spoke. Anna understood the question in their eyes. She lifted the towel slightly in her hand and nodded once. "It is only water," she said calmly in German. The words moved down the line almost instantly as the women repeated them quietly to one another. The tension that had gripped the yard earlier began to soften. Shoulders lowered. Breathing slowed. A few prisoners even allowed themselves small smiles as the fear that had built during the past hour finally dissolved. Lena stepped out beside Anna a moment later, blinking against the brightness of the sun. She looked toward the line of prisoners and then back toward the bathhouse interior where the sound of running water had nearly disappeared. "It is strange," Lena said quietly. "We expected something terrible." Anna nodded again. "War teaches people to expect the worst," she replied. Near the entrance, Sergeant Daniel Carter straightened slightly from where he had been leaning against the wall. He had watched the first group of women emerge from the building with quiet attention. The change in their expressions was easy to see. When they had approached earlier, their movements had been tense, uncertain, almost rigid with fear. Now their posture looked lighter, more natural. Carter understood that kind of transformation well. During the war, he had seen many moments when simple misunderstandings created unnecessary fear between people who were otherwise not so different. He stepped forward and gave a small nod toward the doorway. "Next group," he said in a calm voice. The young guard with the clipboard called the next 5 names from the list. The line moved again, this time with noticeably less hesitation. As the women stepped through the doorway, their movements were cautious but no longer frozen. By dread, word had already spread through the line. Only water. Only showers. Inside the bathhouse, the pipes were running again as new valves opened and fresh steam began to rise into the room. The rhythm of falling water returned, filling the building with the same steady sound that had greeted the first group. Anna and Lena walked slowly toward the barracks together, the dirt beneath their boots still warm from the afternoon sun. A light breeze moved through the camp now, carrying the distant hum of farm machinery from somewhere beyond the hills. For the first time that day, the air felt peaceful again. Lena glanced back once toward the bathhouse building. A faint cloud of steam curled above the metal roof, drifting upward before dissolving into the open sky. "I think they will sleep easier tonight," she said quietly. Anna followed her gaze toward the rising steam. "Yes," she answered. "Sometimes people only need to see the truth once." In the watchtower above the yard, a soldier leaned against the wooden railing, observing the slow movement of prisoners entering and leaving the building below. The entire scene now appeared calm and orderly, the way the camp routine was meant to function. No shouting, no confusion, just the quiet rhythm of daily life continuing beneath the wide Oklahoma sky. As Anna and Lena approached the barracks steps, the evening sunlight had begun to soften into a deeper golden color. The long shadows of the buildings stretched across the ground while the steady wind moved gently through the tall grass beyond the fence. Behind them, the bathhouse door opened again as another group of women stepped outside with towels draped over their shoulders. The fear that had once filled the yard earlier that afternoon had vanished completely, leaving behind something quieter and more familiar. The simple understanding that sometimes the most frightening moments in wartime begin not with danger itself, but with the stories people carry inside their minds. The late afternoon light settled softly across the camp as Anna Weber and Lena Vogel stepped onto the wooden stairs of Barracks 3. The boards beneath their boots creaked quietly, warmed by hours of Oklahoma sun. Inside the barracks, the air felt cooler than outside, shaded by the long roof and narrow windows that allowed only thin strips of light to reach the floor. Several women who had returned earlier from the bathhouse were already seated on their bunks, brushing damp hair or folding their thin towels with careful hands. The mood inside the room had changed noticeably from what it had been earlier that afternoon. The tension that had once filled the barracks had loosened, replaced by the soft murmur of voices and the quiet rustle of fabric. Anna paused near the doorway and looked around the room. For the first time since the loudspeaker announcement, she noticed something small but important. People were breathing normally again. Lena stepped past her and sat on the edge of her bunk, running a small wooden comb through her damp hair. Each stroke moved slowly from forehead to neck as she worked patiently through the tangles. "It feels strange," Lena said quietly in German. "Such a small thing. But it feels like we crossed something today." Anna understood what she meant. The fear had not been about water. It had been about the unknown. In wartime, the unknown often becomes larger than reality itself. Anna sat beside her and looked out the window toward the open yard. From this distance, she could still see the bathhouse building near the center of the compound. A steady line of women continued moving toward the door in groups of 5, but now their steps appeared calm and orderly. The earlier hesitation had disappeared. Steam drifted lightly above the roof as the plumbing inside continued its steady work. The scene looked almost peaceful beneath the wide Oklahoma sky. Across the room, Marta Keller folded her towel and placed it neatly beside her pillow. The older nurse had spent much of the war working in field hospitals before her capture, and her calm presence often helped steady the younger prisoners. She looked toward Anna and Lena with a faint smile. "You two went in first, Marta said gently. That helped the others. Anna shook her head modestly. We were simply the next ones called, she replied. Marta nodded slowly, though her expression suggested she understood more than Anna wished to admit. Sometimes leadership appears quietly without anyone planning it. Outside the barracks, the wind had begun to shift. The long heat of the afternoon was easing as a cooler breeze moved across the fields beyond the fence. The grass bent in slow waves beneath the fading sunlight, while the distant rumble of farm machinery drifted faintly through the air. The camp existed inside its fences, but the sounds of the surrounding countryside often reminded the prisoners that ordinary life continued only a few miles away. Lena leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. I remember the last real shower I had before today, she said thoughtfully. It was in my parents' apartment in Munich. The water heater barely worked, so the water would turn cold after only a few minutes. My brother used to complain every morning. Anna smiled faintly at the memory Lena described. My father always woke before sunrise to bake bread, she replied. The whole apartment would smell warm before anyone else even opened their eyes. Lena opened one eye and looked toward her. Do you think it still smells like that in Hamburg? She asked quietly. Anna did not answer immediately. War had changed so many cities across Europe that it was difficult to know what remained untouched. But she understood the meaning behind Lena's question. People often held on to simple memories when everything else felt uncertain. I think somewhere it still does, Anna said gently. The conversation drifted into silence again as the light outside slowly softened toward evening. One by one, the remaining prisoners returned from the bathhouse and entered the barracks carrying their towels. Each new arrival repeated the same quiet reassurance to those who had not yet gone. Only water. Only showers. The simple phrase moved easily from one bunk to another, replacing the earlier rumors with a calmer understanding of reality. As the line outside finally disappeared, the bathhouse door closed for the evening. A final cloud of steam rose above the roof before fading into the cooling air. Sergeant Daniel Carter remained near the building for a few minutes longer, checking the clipboard in the young guard's hands to confirm that every name had been called. The routine had ended without incident. From the outside, the entire event might have appeared ordinary. But Carter knew better than most people how quickly fear could grow when people carried the weight of war inside their memories. He watched the prisoners return to their barracks in small groups, their steps slower now as the day's tension faded into fatigue. After a moment, he turned and walked toward the guard station near the fence. Inside barracks, the women had begun settling into their evening routine. Some folded their uniforms carefully. Others wrote brief letters in small notebooks they hoped might eventually reach home. A few simply sat quietly, listening to the distant wind moving across the fields. Anna remained near the window watching the sky slowly deepen into shades of orange and purple as the sun sank toward the horizon. The steam that had once frightened them had vanished completely now. Only the memory remained. Lena stood and stretched slightly before placing her comb on the small shelf beside her bunk. You were right earlier, she said softly. Anna turned toward her. About what? Lena smiled faintly. About the truth, she replied. Sometimes people only need to see it once. Outside the camp fence, the evening breeze carried the smell of fresh grass across the quiet fields of Oklahoma. The wide sky stretched endlessly above the land while the first faint stars began to appear in the darkening blue. Inside the barracks, the women moved calmly through the simple tasks of another night in captivity, their earlier fear now replaced by something quieter and steadier. The understanding that not every shadow in wartime hides danger. Sometimes it only hides a moment that waits patiently to prove itself ordinary. The evening settled slowly over the camp as the last color of sunset faded beyond the Oklahoma fields. The sky above the barracks shifted from gold to a deep shade of blue, and the long heat of the afternoon finally began to loosen its grip on the land. A cooler wind moved across the compound, brushing softly against the wooden walls and carrying with it the quiet smell of grass and distant farmland. Inside Barracks 3, the women had grown quieter. The simple rhythm of the camp evening had returned. Boots rested beside bunks. Towels hung neatly over bed frames to dry. A few dim bulbs along the ceiling flickered on as daylight disappeared from the narrow windows. Anna Weber sat near the window with her hands folded loosely in her lap, watching the sky darken above the fence line. The tall barbed wire fence cast thin shadows across the yard, but beyond it the land stretched wide and open without barriers. Even from a distance, the silence of the countryside felt different from the silence inside the camp. One belonged to freedom. The other belonged to waiting. Lena Vogel lay back against her pillow and stared at the wooden ceiling above her bunk. The faint hum of insects drifted through the open window beside her. "It is strange how quickly fear disappears," Lena said quietly in German. Anna turned slightly toward her. "Fear leaves slowly," she replied. "But understanding arrives quickly." Lena considered the thought for a moment. The events of the afternoon had already begun to feel distant, as if they had happened days ago, instead of only a few hours earlier. That was another strange quality of wartime life. Moments of tension could pass quickly, yet the memory of them remained long afterward. Across the room, Marta Keller sat writing in a small notebook balanced on her knee. She wrote carefully, forming each letter slowly in the dim light. Many of the prisoners kept notebooks like that, even though they knew the pages might never reach home. Writing gave shape to the passing days. Without it, time inside the camp could feel endless and shapeless. Anna watched her for a moment before returning her gaze to the window. Outside the barracks, the guard towers stood quietly beneath the darkening sky. A single lantern glowed near the main gate, where two soldiers moved slowly through their evening rounds. From somewhere beyond the fence, a dog barked faintly, followed by the distant rumble of a truck traveling along a country road miles away. The world beyond the camp continued its ordinary routines, even while war stretched across continents far beyond this quiet place in Oklahoma. Lena sat up again and pulled her blanket around her shoulders. "When the loudspeaker called us this afternoon," she said thoughtfully, "I felt certain something terrible would happen." Anna nodded slowly. "Many people did," she said. Lena looked toward the door of the barracks, where a few women were still returning from the mess hall with cups of evening coffee. "But nothing happened," Lena continued. "Only water." Anna smiled faintly. "Sometimes the mind can create storms where none exist," she said gently. The words carried the quiet weight of someone who had seen both real danger and imagined fear during the war years. The small conversation faded again into silence as the evening grew darker. One by one the women settled into their bunks while the dim bulbs overhead cast soft pools of yellow light across the wooden floor. The day had been long, and fatigue slowly replaced the earlier tension that had gripped the barracks. Outside near the bathhouse building, Sergeant Daniel Carter completed his final inspection of the compound. He walked slowly across the packed dirt yard, his boots crunching softly against the ground. The steam that had once risen from the roof of the bathhouse was gone now. The metal pipes inside had cooled, leaving the building quiet and still beneath the night sky. Carter paused briefly near the doorway and glanced toward the barracks. Light glowed faintly through the narrow windows while shadows moved gently inside as the prisoners prepared for sleep. From his perspective, the entire afternoon had been only a minor moment in the routine of the camp. But he understood that for the women inside the barracks it had meant something more. War filled the mind with stories, and stories could grow into fear if left unanswered. Tonight, at least, one of those stories had been quietly replaced with truth. Carter turned and walked toward the guard station near the fence. The night air felt cooler now as the breeze continued to move across the open fields beyond the compound. In the distance, the lights of a small farmhouse glowed softly against the horizon, reminding him of home only a few hundred miles away. Inside Barracks 3, Anna finally stood and closed the window halfway as the air grew cooler. The breeze still moved gently through the room, carrying the sound of crickets from the grass outside the fence. Lena had already curled beneath her blanket, her breathing slow and steady as sleep approached. Around them, the other women settled into the quiet rhythm of night inside the camp. Anna lay down on her bunk and stared briefly at the ceiling beams above her. Her thoughts returned once more to the moment earlier that afternoon when the loudspeaker had first spoken. The tension in the room, the uncertainty, the line of women standing silently beneath the hot sun. It seemed almost impossible now that such a simple misunderstanding could create so much fear. Yet war had taught her that fear rarely followed logic. It followed memory, and memory could travel across oceans. Slowly her eyes closed as the exhaustion of the day settled over her. Outside the barracks, the Oklahoma night stretched wide and calm across the quiet land. The stars appeared one by one above the dark fields while the steady wind continued, moving through the grass beyond the fence. Inside the camp, the prisoners slept beneath the dim glow of the barracks lights, their earlier fears replaced by the quiet understanding that sometimes the most frightening moments of war are not created by danger itself, but by the shadows that uncertainty leaves inside the human mind. Morning arrived quietly over the Oklahoma camp as the first pale light spread across the wide horizon beyond the fence. The sky began as a soft gray line above the fields before slowly turning blue as the sun lifted behind the distant hills. A cool breeze moved through the tall grass outside the compound, carrying the gentle sound of birds waking somewhere along the tree line. Inside barracks, the women began stirring one by one as the faint glow of morning filtered through the narrow windows. The wooden walls held the coolness of the night, and for a few peaceful minutes the room remained still except for the soft movement of blankets and the quiet rustle of fabric. Anna Weber opened her eyes slowly and listened to the sounds of the camp returning to life. Somewhere beyond the barracks a metal gate creaked as a guard completed his morning round. A moment later the distant hum of a generator started near the main station, followed by the faint clatter of dishes from the mess hall preparing breakfast. The familiar rhythm of another day had begun. Anna sat up on her bunk and brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face. For a brief moment she felt disoriented, the way people sometimes do when waking in an unfamiliar place. Then the memory of the previous afternoon returned clearly. The loudspeaker announcement, the line outside the bathhouse, the quiet fear that had moved through the barracks like a shadow, and then the simple truth that had replaced it. Only water. She glanced across the room where Lena Vogel was still curled beneath her blanket, her breathing slow and steady. The younger woman had fallen asleep quickly the night before, exhaustion finally replacing the tension she had carried all afternoon. Anna stood quietly and walked toward the window. Outside the compound, the Oklahoma countryside stretched wide and open beneath the rising sun. The fields were covered in a light layer of morning mist that drifted slowly across the grass like a thin white veil. A small group of cattle grazed in the distance beyond a wooden fence that marked the edge of a nearby farm. The scene looked peaceful in a way that almost felt unreal during wartime. Inside the barracks a few other prisoners had begun rising as well. Marta Keller folded her blanket neatly and placed it at the foot of her bunk before reaching for the small notebook she kept beside her pillow. She often wrote early in the morning when the camp was quiet. Anna watched her for a moment before returning her attention to the window. The memory of the previous afternoon still lingered gently in her thoughts. Not as fear anymore, but as a lesson about how easily people can misunderstand one another when the world around them is uncertain. Lena finally stirred and sat up slowly, blinking against the pale light. "Is it morning already?" she asked softly in German. Anna nodded. "The sun is just coming up." Lena rubbed her eyes and glanced around the room as if remembering where she was. Then her expression shifted as the events of the previous day returned to her mind. "I slept better than I expected," she admitted quietly. Anna smiled faintly. "Understanding brings rest," she replied. Lena swung her feet over the edge of the bunk and stretched her arms gently. The cool air in the barracks felt refreshing after the heavy heat of the previous afternoon. She stood and walked beside Anna to the window. Together they watched the sun rise above the distant fields. The light spread slowly across the land, turning the mist into bright ribbons that drifted over the grass before disappearing completely. From somewhere beyond the fence the sound of a tractor engine started, its steady rhythm echoing faintly across the morning air. The farmers in the surrounding countryside had already begun their workday. Inside the camp the loudspeaker crackled briefly before the morning announcement began. The voice that followed was calm and routine, listing the usual schedule for breakfast and work assignments. The words carried no urgency, no fear, only the ordinary instructions that shaped each day inside the compound. Lena listened carefully before turning toward Anna again. "Yesterday, I thought everything was about to change," she said thoughtfully. "But today it feels the same as before." Anna considered the thought for a moment. "Sometimes nothing outside changes," she said gently. "Only the way we see it." The women around them continued preparing for the day, tying back their hair and folding their blankets with practiced movements. The simple routine created a quiet sense of order inside the room. Outside the barracks door, the gravel path was already filling with prisoners walking toward the mess hall. Their footsteps moved slowly across the ground, while the guards watched calmly from the nearby tower. Near the center of the compound, the bathhouse building stood quietly beneath the morning sun. The steam from the previous afternoon had long since vanished. The metal roof reflected the pale light, while the wooden walls looked ordinary and harmless in the clear daylight. If someone had walked past the building that morning without knowing the story from the day before, they might never guess that it had once been the center of so much fear. Anna watched it for a moment through the window. The building had not changed. Only the understanding around it had changed. Lena followed her gaze and nodded quietly. "It looks smaller today," she said. Anna understood what she meant. Fear often makes ordinary things appear larger than they truly are. Outside the barracks, the morning breeze continued moving across the open fields while the sun climbed higher into the sky. The wide land beyond the fence stretched endlessly in every direction, calm and steady beneath the growing light. Inside the camp, the prisoners began another day of waiting, working, and remembering. Yet something subtle had shifted since the afternoon before. The stories that once filled the silence between them had lost their power, and in their place remained a quieter understanding that sometimes the truth, once seen clearly, is far less frightening than the shadows people imagine in the dark. The morning continued to unfold across the Oklahoma camp as the sun climbed higher above the wide fields beyond the fence. The soft mist that had covered the grass earlier slowly disappeared beneath the growing warmth of daylight. Inside the compound, the routine of the day moved forward with quiet efficiency. Prisoners walked in small groups toward their assigned work details while guards observed from the towers and pathways with calm, practiced attention. Nothing about the scene suggested the tension that had once filled the yard the afternoon before. Anna Weber and Lena Vogel stepped out of barracks 3 together and joined the slow line moving toward the mess hall. The ground beneath their boots was still slightly cool from the night air, but the sun was already beginning to warm the packed dirt paths between the buildings. A few birds circled above the camp fence before drifting away toward the open countryside. The smell of coffee and fresh bread drifted faintly from the mess hall doors ahead. Lena inhaled the scent and smiled quietly. "That reminds me of home," she said softly in German. Anna nodded. "Food always does," she replied. Inside the mess hall, the long wooden tables were already filling with prisoners. Metal trays slid across the serving counter, while cooks in white aprons moved steadily behind the line. The routine was simple and orderly. Coffee, bread, eggs when supplies allowed. It was not luxurious, but it was enough to sustain the people living inside the camp. Anna and Lena carried their trays to an open space along one of the tables and sat beside Marta Keller and several other women from their barracks. The room hummed with low conversation as the prisoners ate and prepared for the day ahead. Marta looked up as Anna sat down. "Did you see the bathhouse this morning?" she asked quietly. Anna nodded. "It looks smaller today." Marta smiled faintly. Fear often enlarges ordinary things. Lena stirred her coffee slowly while listening to the conversation around her. Many of the women were still discussing the events of the previous afternoon, though the tone had shifted completely. What had once been tense whispers was now calm reflection. One woman described how she had hesitated at the doorway before finally stepping inside. Another admitted that she had been certain something terrible was waiting behind the steam. Now they spoke about it almost with disbelief. Outside the mess hall windows, the camp continued its morning routine beneath the bright Oklahoma sky. Work trucks moved slowly along the dirt road near the fence while a pair of guards walked between the barracks completing their rounds. In the distance, the same tractor Anna had heard earlier continued its steady path across the fields beyond the compound. The ordinary rhythm of the land seemed unaffected by the war that had carried so many people across oceans and continents. After breakfast, the prisoners moved toward their assigned work areas. Some walked toward the vegetable gardens along the edge of the compound. Others were directed toward the small workshop buildings where repairs and maintenance were completed. Anna and Lena joined a group assigned to sort and clean equipment used for the camp laundry. The work was simple but required careful attention. Baskets were lifted, sheets were folded, tools were cleaned and stacked neatly along the wooden shelves inside the building. As they worked, the conversation occasionally returned to the previous afternoon. The story was spreading quietly through the camp as women from other barracks learned what had happened. A few prisoners who had not been present the day before listened with wide eyes as the details were described. Anna noticed something interesting as she watched their reactions. The women who had experienced the moment themselves spoke calmly, almost lightly, about the misunderstanding that had created so much fear. But those hearing the story for the first time still reacted with surprise. Fear, once imagined, can linger longer in people who did not witness the truth directly. During a short break, Anna stepped outside the laundry building and looked toward the center of the compound. The bathhouse stood exactly where it had always stood, quiet and unchanged beneath the bright sun. Its metal roof glimmered faintly while the wooden walls cast short shadows across the ground. Nothing about the building suggested the emotions that had once surrounded it. Sergeant Daniel Carter walked past along the gravel path, carrying a clipboard under his arm. He paused briefly when he saw Anna standing near the doorway. For a moment, the two simply acknowledged one another with a small nod. Neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. Carter understood that the previous afternoon had meant more to the prisoners than it had appeared from the outside. Anna understood that the calm routine of the camp had prevented a misunderstanding from growing into something worse. Carter continued walking toward the supply shed near the fence while Anna returned inside the laundry building. Lena was stacking clean sheets onto a wooden cart when she looked up. "You were watching the bathhouse again," Lena said with a faint smile. Anna nodded slightly. "I think yesterday will stay in people's memories for a long time." Lena placed the last sheet on the stack and leaned against the cart. "Not because something terrible happened," she said thoughtfully, "but because something terrible did not happen." Anna considered the idea and then smiled. Sometimes that is the most important difference. Outside the laundry building, the sun continued rising toward midday while the steady breeze moved across the open fields beyond the camp fence. The land looked wide and calm beneath the bright sky. Inside the compound, the prisoners worked quietly through their tasks while the guards observed from their posts with steady patience. The events of the previous afternoon were already becoming part of the camp's shared memory. A moment when fear had briefly taken hold before giving way to something simpler and clearer. The understanding that not every unknown door hides danger behind it. Sometimes it only hides the quiet truth waiting on the other side. By late morning, the sun had climbed high above the Oklahoma fields, spreading bright light across the camp and warming the packed dirt paths that ran between the wooden buildings. The breeze that had moved gently through the compound earlier had softened now, leaving the air still and quiet beneath the clear blue sky. Inside the laundry building, Anna Weber and Lena Vogel continued their work with the steady rhythm that had already become familiar after months inside the camp. Clean sheets moved from one wooden table to another while baskets were stacked neatly along the wall. The work itself required little conversation, but the quiet atmosphere allowed thoughts to move easily through the mind. Anna lifted a folded blanket and placed it onto the cart beside her before pausing briefly to stretch her arms. From the open doorway, she could see the center of the compound where the bathhouse stood in the sunlight. The building looked completely ordinary again. A simple wooden structure with a metal roof and a narrow window along the side. If someone had arrived at the camp that morning without hearing the story from the previous afternoon, they might never imagine that the place had once been surrounded by such uncertainty. Lena noticed Anna glancing toward the yard again and followed her gaze. "You are still thinking about it," Lena said quietly in German. Anna nodded once. "It is not the building itself," she replied thoughtfully. "It is the way people reacted to it." Lena leaned against the wooden table and folded her arms loosely while considering the idea. "Fear travels quickly," she said, "especially during war." Anna understood exactly what she meant. Stories had moved across Europe for years during the conflict, carried by soldiers, refugees, and prisoners who had crossed entire countries while searching for safety. Some stories were true. Others were shaped by confusion, exhaustion, or imagination. But once they reached enough ears, they often took on a life of their own. Lena picked up another sheet and began folding it carefully. "Yesterday," she said slowly, "I realized something important." Anna glanced toward her. "What is that?" Lena smiled faintly. "Many of the things we fear are not standing in front of us. They are standing inside our heads." Anna could not help but smile at the quiet wisdom of the remark. Outside the building, a truck rolled slowly along the dirt road near the fence, carrying crates of supplies toward the storage shed. The tires crunched softly against the gravel while a guard walked alongside the vehicle, checking the list on his clipboard. The steady routine of the camp continued without interruption. A few minutes later, Sergeant Daniel Carter appeared along the path again, walking toward the equipment shed beside the laundry building. The sunlight reflected off the small metal badge on his uniform as he approached. Anna noticed him through the doorway, but returned to her work without drawing attention. Carter paused briefly outside the building and looked across the yard toward the bathhouse. From where he stood, the structure appeared quiet and harmless beneath the bright sky. The events of the previous afternoon already seemed distant. Yet he knew that inside the barracks the memory would remain much longer. People often remembered the moment when fear dissolved just as clearly as they remembered the moment when it first appeared. Carter adjusted the brim of his cap and continued walking toward the shed, where several tools needed inspection before the afternoon shift. Inside the laundry building, Lena finished folding the stack of sheets and placed them carefully onto the cart. "Do you think people will still talk about yesterday a week from now?" she asked. Anna considered the question carefully. "Perhaps," she said, "but not in the same way." Lena tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" Anna wiped her hands on a cloth towel before answering. "Today the story sounds different," she explained. "Yesterday, it was about fear. Tomorrow it will be about understanding." Lena nodded slowly as the meaning became clear. Stories can change as time passes. The same event can feel frightening at one moment and almost comforting later when people realize how easily misunderstanding can grow. Outside the laundry building, the bright midday sun filled the yard with light, while the wide Oklahoma sky stretched endlessly above the camp fence. The fields beyond the compound shimmered in the distance as heat began to rise gently from the grass. The world continued moving forward with calm certainty. After finishing the morning tasks, the prisoners were given a short break before the afternoon work assignments began. Anna stepped outside the building and walked slowly toward the edge of the compound where a narrow path ran along the fence line. From there she could see far across the surrounding farmland. Rows of crops extended toward the horizon, while a pair of windmills turned slowly in the steady breeze. It was a peaceful landscape, far removed from the destruction that had marked so many places in Europe. Lena joined her a moment later and leaned lightly against the fence beside her. The metal wires were warm from the sun, but not uncomfortable to touch. "It is strange to think that such a quiet place exists in the middle of a war," Lena said softly. Anna nodded. "War does not reach everywhere in the same way," she replied. For a few minutes they stood in silence, watching the fields move gently beneath the wind. The moment felt calm and reflective, as if the land itself carried a quiet patience that did not belong to the conflict happening across the ocean. Lena finally spoke again. "Yesterday, I believed something terrible was waiting behind that door," she said thoughtfully. Anna looked toward the bathhouse in the distance before answering. "And today you know the truth." Lena smiled slightly. "Yes," she said, "and the truth is much smaller than the fear." Anna watched the sunlight reflecting from the metal roof of the building and felt the quiet certainty of that statement settle into her thoughts. Sometimes understanding arrives not through grand events or dramatic changes, but through a simple moment when people realize that the world is not as dark as they once imagined. Behind them, the camp bell rang softly, signaling the end of the break and the return to work. Anna and Lena stepped away from the fence and walked back toward the laundry building together as the afternoon tasks awaited them. The routine of the day continued steadily beneath the wide Oklahoma sky, while the memory of the previous afternoon slowly transformed from fear into something quieter and wiser. The afternoon sun hung high above the Oklahoma camp as Anna Weber and Lena Vogel returned to the laundry building to continue their work. The air had grown warmer again, though a gentle breeze still drifted across the open fields beyond the fence. Inside the building, the wooden tables were already covered with stacks of linens waiting to be sorted and folded. The quiet rhythm of work resumed as soon as the women stepped back inside. Hands moved carefully across the fabric. Sheets were lifted, folded, and placed onto carts that would later be returned to the barracks. The routine was simple, almost mechanical, yet it carried a certain comfort. In wartime, even small routines can create a sense of stability. Anna folded a large canvas sheet and placed it neatly on the growing pile beside her. As she worked, she noticed that the conversation inside the room had changed compared to the previous day. The women were no longer whispering uncertain questions about the unknown. Instead, they spoke calmly about ordinary things. The weather, letters from home, the small details of daily life inside the camp. Lena noticed the same change and smiled quietly while smoothing the corner of a blanket. Yesterday, the entire room felt tense, she said softly in German. Today, it feels like a normal morning. Anna nodded while adjusting the stack of folded fabric. Because yesterday people imagined something terrible, she replied. Today they understand the truth. Lena leaned slightly against the table and looked toward the doorway, where sunlight streamed across the wooden floor. It is strange how powerful imagination can be, she said thoughtfully. A building that holds nothing more than warm water suddenly becomes something frightening. Anna paused for a moment before answering. Fear grows easily when people are far from home, she said gently. The words carried the quiet weight of someone who had watched many people struggle with uncertainty during the war. Outside the laundry building, a pair of guards walked slowly along the gravel path, their boots crunching softly against the ground. Sergeant Daniel Carter moved among them, checking several storage crates that had arrived earlier that morning. His movements were calm and steady, the practiced routine of someone accustomed to maintaining order inside the camp. Carter glanced briefly toward the bathhouse across the yard. The building looked exactly as it had every other day since it was constructed. Plain wooden walls, a metal roof reflecting sunlight. Nothing about it suggested the emotions it had stirred only 24 hours earlier. Carter understood that such moments were common during wartime. Rumors traveled quickly among prisoners and soldiers alike. Sometimes those rumors faded quietly when reality proved them wrong. Inside the laundry building, Anna finished folding the last sheet and placed it carefully onto the cart. Lena wiped her hands with a cloth towel before glancing toward the open door again. Do you remember how quiet the line was yesterday? Lena asked. Anna did remember. The silence had been heavy and tense, as if every person standing in the yard had been holding the same breath at the same time. I remember, she said quietly. Lena nodded slowly. I think everyone was thinking the same thing. Anna understood exactly what she meant. Sometimes fear spreads not because people speak about it, but because they remain silent together. A shared uncertainty can move through a group like an invisible current. Lena picked up a small basket of folded towels and placed it onto the shelf beside the wall. But once the first person stepped inside, she continued, everything changed. Anna looked toward her and smiled faintly, because the truth became visible. Outside the building, the afternoon light had begun to soften slightly as the sun moved westward across the sky. Long shadows from the barracks stretched slowly across the yard while the steady wind returned from the open fields. The grass beyond the fence moved gently beneath the breeze, creating quiet waves that rolled across the landscape. Anna stepped toward the doorway and looked out across the compound for a moment. The bathhouse stood calmly beneath the sunlight, no longer surrounded by uncertainty. A few prisoners walked past it on their way toward the garden area along the far side of the camp. None of them hesitated when passing the building now. It had simply returned to its place as part of the ordinary routine. Lena joined her at the doorway and followed her gaze across the yard. It seems smaller now, she said again. Anna nodded. Fear makes things appear larger than they truly are. Lena leaned lightly against the wooden frame of the door. I suppose that is true about many things during war, she said quietly. Anna considered the thought for a moment. War changes how people see the world, she replied. But sometimes it also teaches them to see more clearly. Lena smiled faintly at the idea. The afternoon work continued for several more hours as the women completed their tasks inside the laundry building. Outside the camp, the sound of farm equipment drifted occasionally across the fields while the sky slowly shifted toward the golden tones of late afternoon. Sergeant Carter completed another round of inspections before pausing near the fence line where the land opened wide toward the horizon. From that distance, the camp appeared small against the vast Oklahoma countryside, a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by fences and watchtowers, temporary structures placed within a much larger landscape. Carter looked back toward the bathhouse once more before turning toward the guard station. The events of the previous afternoon had already begun fading into the ordinary memory of camp life. Yet he suspected that for the prisoners inside Barracks 3 the lesson would remain longer than the fear itself. Inside the laundry building, Anna and Lena finished stacking the final bundles of folded fabric. The cart was full now, ready to be returned to the storage room before evening arrived. Lena pushed the cart slowly toward the door while Anna walked beside her. The sunlight outside had grown warmer and softer as the day approached its final hours. "Do you think we will remember yesterday after the war ends?" Lena asked quietly. Anna looked across the yard once more before answering. "Yes," she said gently. "Not because we were afraid, but because we learned something." Lena nodded in quiet agreement as they stepped out into the afternoon light. The wide Oklahoma sky stretched above them, while the steady breeze moved through the fields beyond the fence. In that moment, the camp felt calm and ordinary again. The shadows of fear replaced by the quiet understanding that sometimes the most powerful change begins when people discover that the truth is far simpler than the stories they once believed. The late afternoon light settled across the Oklahoma camp with a gentle calm that seemed to slow the pace of everything beneath it. The long workday was beginning to fade, and the sun drifted gradually toward the wide western horizon beyond the fields. A soft golden glow covered the barracks, the gravel paths, and the quiet wooden buildings that formed the center of the compound. Anna Weber and Lena Vogel pushed the cart of folded linens slowly along the dirt path toward the storage room near the edge of the yard. The wheels creaked softly against the ground as they moved forward, leaving faint tracks in the warm dust. Around them, the camp was beginning its gradual transition from afternoon labor to evening routine. Small groups of prisoners returned from their assigned work details, while guards watched calmly from their posts. The atmosphere felt steady and familiar again, as if the tension that had once passed through the camp had been carried away by the wind. Lena pushed the cart carefully up the small wooden ramp leading into the storage building, while Anna steadied the stacked bundles to keep them from shifting. Inside the building, the air felt cooler, shaded from the heat of the afternoon sun. Wooden shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, already filled with neatly folded blankets, sheets, and towels that would be distributed throughout the camp as needed. Together, they lifted the bundles from the cart and placed them carefully onto the shelves. The quiet sound of fabric brushing against wood echoed softly through the small room. When the final bundle had been placed in its proper position, Lena wiped her hands and leaned lightly against the shelf. "Another day finished," she said quietly in German. Anna nodded. "Yes, and this one felt different." Lena tilted her head slightly. "Because of yesterday?" Anna considered the question before answering. "Not only because of yesterday," she replied. "Because of what yesterday changed." Lena stepped toward the open doorway and looked outside. The sun was now lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the compound. The bathhouse stood in the distance exactly where it had stood all along, quiet and unremarkable beneath the warm light. "It is strange how quickly things can change," Lena said softly. "One moment everyone is afraid. The next moment everything feels normal again." Anna joined her at the doorway and looked toward the building as well. "Fear often disappears when people see the truth clearly," she said gently. Outside the storage room, Sergeant Daniel Carter walked along the gravel path, checking the final tasks of the afternoon. His uniform sleeves were rolled neatly above his elbows, and his clipboard rested against his arm as he paused occasionally to speak with the other guards. From where he stood, he could see much of the camp at once. The barracks, the workshop buildings, the bathhouse in the center of the yard. Carter had spent enough time inside the camp to recognize when the atmosphere among the prisoners had changed. The tension he had noticed the day before was gone now. In its place, there was something quieter and steadier. People walked with relaxed shoulders. Conversations flowed easily again. The routine had returned. Carter glanced toward the bathhouse briefly before continuing his walk toward the guard station. Inside the storage building, Anna and Lena stepped back outside and closed the wooden door behind them. The warm evening breeze brushed gently across the yard, carrying with it the smell of grass from the fields beyond the fence. In the distance, the faint rumble of a tractor engine could still be heard moving slowly across the farmland. The land beyond the camp continued its peaceful rhythm while the war remained far away across the ocean. "Do you think the others will stop talking about yesterday soon?" Lena asked quietly as they walked back toward the barracks. Anna smiled faintly. "They may talk about it for a while," she said, "but not in the same way." Lena glanced toward her curiously. "What do you mean?" Anna walked slowly along the dirt path, watching the long shadows stretch across the ground before answering. Yesterday people spoke about fear, she explained. Soon they will speak about how that fear disappeared. Lena nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like a better story. As they approached barracks, several of the other women were already gathering outside the entrance, enjoying the cooler air before the evening meal. Marta Keller sat on the wooden step with her notebook resting on her knee, writing slowly as the light softened around her. She looked up when Anna and Lena approached. The day is nearly finished, Marta said with a calm smile. Yes, Anna replied. And it has been a quiet one. Marta closed her notebook gently. Sometimes quiet days are the most important ones. Lena sat beside her on the step and looked across the yard toward the center of the camp. Yesterday did not feel quiet at all, she said. Marta nodded slowly. But today does, she replied. The women sat together for a moment, in peaceful silence while the sky above them slowly changed color. The bright blue of the afternoon faded into warm shades of orange and gold as the sun sank lower beyond the fields. The bathhouse stood quietly in the distance, its metal roof reflecting the last light of the day. Anna watched it for a moment before looking away. The building no longer held any mystery. It had returned to being exactly what it had always been. A simple place where water flowed from pipes and steam rose into the air. Nothing more. The bell from the mess hall rang softly across the compound, signaling that the evening meal was ready. The prisoners stood gradually and began walking toward the building in small groups. Anna and Lena joined them, moving slowly along the familiar path. As they walked, Lena spoke again in a thoughtful voice. I think yesterday taught us something important. Anna looked toward her. What is that? Lena smiled quietly. That sometimes the scariest moment in life is simply the moment before we discover the truth. Anna nodded in agreement as the warm evening breeze moved gently through the camp. Around them the prisoners continued toward the mess hall while the last light of the day settled across the wide Oklahoma fields. The routine of the camp carried forward into another peaceful evening, leaving behind the quiet understanding that the shadows people fear most often disappear when the light of truth finally reaches them. The evening settled gently over the Oklahoma camp as the last light of the sun slipped beyond the distant fields. A calm golden glow lingered along the horizon, while the sky above slowly deepened into a soft shade of blue. Inside the mess hall the prisoners sat along the long wooden tables, finishing their evening meal. The room was filled with quiet conversation and the soft clatter of metal utensils against trays. The tension that had once shaped the previous day had completely disappeared now, replaced by the familiar rhythm of routine that marked life inside the camp. Anna Weber sat beside Lena Vogel and Marta Keller near the center of the table. The warm light from the overhead bulbs reflected softly across the wooden surface, while the windows along the wall showed the fading colors of sunset outside. Lena lifted her cup of coffee and glanced toward the window where the last strip of sunlight rested across the open yard. It is peaceful tonight, she said quietly in German. Anna followed her gaze and nodded. Yes, the whole camp feels calm again. Marta folded her hands on the table and looked thoughtfully toward the door of the mess hall, where prisoners continued to enter and leave in small groups. Sometimes calm arrives only after people learn something important, she said gently. Lena looked toward her with curiosity. You think yesterday changed something? Marta smiled faintly. Perhaps not the camp itself, but perhaps the way people inside it see the world. Anna listened carefully to those words. She understood that Marta was not only speaking about the misunderstanding that had happened near the bathhouse. She was speaking about something larger. During war, people often build invisible walls in their minds. Walls made from fear, rumors, and memories carried across long distances. Sometimes those walls fall quietly when reality proves different than what people expected. After finishing their meal, the women carried their trays toward the washing station before stepping outside into the cooling evening air. The breeze that moved through the camp now felt fresh after the warmth of the day. The sky above had turned deep blue, and the first stars had begun to appear above the wide Oklahoma fields. Anna paused near the entrance of the mess hall and looked across the compound. The bathhouse stood quietly in the center of the yard, its wooden walls darkened slightly in the fading light. Earlier, that same building had been surrounded by tension and uncertainty. Now it stood unnoticed as prisoners walked calmly past it on their way back to the barracks. Lena noticed Anna looking in that direction again. You still think about it, she said gently. Anna nodded slightly. Not with fear anymore, she replied. Only with understanding. Lena leaned lightly against the wooden railing beside the mess hall steps. I was certain something terrible would happen, she admitted quietly. Anna turned toward her friend. Many people were certain. Lena smiled faintly as she looked across the yard again. And now it feels almost strange that we were afraid at all. Anna did not answer immediately. She knew that fear often feels strange after it disappears. But in the moment when people experience it, fear can feel completely real. Marta stepped outside a moment later and joined them near the steps. The older nurse adjusted her small notebook beneath her arm before looking toward the sky. The stars are clear tonight, she said softly. Anna followed her gaze upward. The sky stretched wide and endless above the camp, filled with quiet points of light that seemed almost untouched by the war happening across the ocean. In moments like this, it was easy to imagine that the world beyond the fence remained peaceful and steady. Across the compound, Sergeant Daniel Carter completed his final inspection of the evening. He walked slowly along the gravel path beside the guard tower while the lanterns along the fence line flickered on one by one. Their warm yellow glow illuminated the yard with gentle pools of light. Carter paused briefly and looked across the compound. From his position, he could see the bathhouse clearly standing beneath the darkening sky. The building looked small against the wide landscape around it. A simple structure performing a simple purpose. Yet Carter understood that sometimes even the simplest places can hold unexpected meaning when people bring their fears and expectations with them. Inside barracks, three of the women began preparing for the night. Blankets were straightened across bunks. Towels hung neatly along the wooden frames. The dim overhead bulbs cast soft light across the quiet room while the sounds of evening settled gently around them. Anna sat on the edge of her bunk and removed her shoes before placing them carefully beneath the bed. Lena climbed onto the bunk beside her and leaned back against the pillow with a thoughtful expression. If someone new arrived tomorrow, Lena said quietly, they would never know what happened yesterday. Anna smiled slightly. Perhaps not, she replied. Lena looked toward her. But we will remember. Anna nodded. Yes, not because it was frightening, but because it showed us something important. Lena rested her hands behind her head while considering the idea. That sometimes our fears are only shadows, she said slowly. Anna looked toward the small window where the dark sky stretched beyond the fence. And shadows disappear when light reaches them, she added gently. The room grew quiet as the women settled into their beds one by one. Outside the barracks, the Oklahoma night moved calmly across the fields while the steady wind rustled through the tall grass beyond the fence. The lanterns along the camp perimeter glowed softly in the darkness, marking the boundaries of the small world inside the compound. Anna closed her eyes and listened to the peaceful sounds of the night. The memory of the previous afternoon no longer carried tension or confusion. It had transformed into something simpler and clearer. A reminder that the most powerful changes in understanding often arrive through the smallest moments of truth. And sometimes those moments appear quietly in places as ordinary as a wooden building where warm water flows from simple pipes beneath a wide and peaceful sky. The night settled fully over the Oklahoma camp as the final lanterns along the fence flickered steadily in the darkness. The wide sky above the fields had turned deep and quiet, filled with thousands of stars scattered across the horizon like distant lights that no war could reach. Inside barracks, the room had grown still as the women slept beneath their blankets, the long day finally giving way to rest. Outside the wooden walls, a soft wind moved through the grass beyond the fence, carrying the steady rhythm of crickets and the faint rustle of leaves from the cottonwood trees that lined the road near the camp entrance. Anna Weber lay awake for a few moments longer, listening to those sounds. The events of the past 2 days moved slowly through her thoughts, no longer with tension, but with a quiet sense of clarity. She remembered the moment when the loudspeaker had first called them to the bathhouse, the silence that had filled the barracks, the line of women standing beneath the hot afternoon sun, uncertain about what waited behind the wooden door. In that moment, fear had seemed enormous, almost overwhelming. Yet now, in the calm of night, the memory felt different, smaller, clearer. The fear itself had never been real. Only the uncertainty had been. She turned her head slightly toward the small window beside her bunk. Beyond the glass, the lantern light along the fence cast soft circles across the ground, while the wide Oklahoma fields stretched silently into the distance. Somewhere far away, a train whistle echoed faintly across the night air, its long, lonely sound drifting across the open land before fading again into silence. That sound reminded Anna how far from home she truly was. An ocean separated this quiet place from the cities and streets where her life had once been ordinary. Yet in a strange way, the events of the previous afternoon had reminded her that humanity did not disappear simply because people stood on different sides of a war. Sometimes it appeared quietly in the smallest moments. Across the compound, Sergeant Daniel Carter completed his final walk around the perimeter fence. The lanterns illuminated the gravel path beneath his boots as he moved steadily between the towers. The camp was quiet tonight. No raised voices. No confusion. Only the steady order of routine that kept everything moving smoothly from one day to the next. Carter paused briefly near the center of the yard where the bathhouse stood beneath the lantern light. The building looked almost peaceful now, its wooden walls casting long shadows across the ground. If someone had walked past it without knowing the story from the day before, they might never imagine that it had once been the focus of so much uncertainty. Carter rested one hand lightly on the wooden railing near the path and looked toward the barracks. He understood that the moment had not been important because of the building itself. It had been important because of what it revealed about people. Fear can travel long distances. Rumors can cross oceans. But truth often arrives quietly, without force or confrontation, simply by being seen clearly. After a moment, Carter turned and continued his patrol toward the guard station as the wind moved gently through the camp once more. Inside the barracks, Lena Vogel shifted slightly in her sleep before opening her eyes. For a moment, she stared at the ceiling beams above her bunk, listening to the soft night sounds outside the window. Then she turned her head toward Anna. "Are you awake?" she whispered quietly in German. Anna nodded faintly in the dim light. "Yes." Lena smiled sleepily. "I was thinking about yesterday again." Anna understood. Some memories take time to settle fully in the mind. "So was I," she said softly. Lena rested her head against the pillow and looked toward the window where the faint lantern light glowed beyond the glass. "It is strange," Lena said thoughtfully. "The moment we feared the most turned out to be the moment that taught us the most." Anna remained silent for a moment, considering the truth of that statement. Then she answered quietly, "Sometimes the moment before we understand something is the most frightening one." Lena nodded slowly. "But once we see clearly, the fear disappears." Anna looked again toward the quiet sky beyond the window. The stars above Oklahoma shone with steady light that had traveled across unimaginable distances to reach the earth. In that moment, she realized that understanding often travels in the same quiet way, slowly, patiently, until one day it reaches the place where it is needed. The night air moved gently through the barracks as Lena finally closed her eyes again. Within a few minutes, her breathing grew steady as sleep returned. Anna remained awake for only a moment longer before resting her head against the pillow. The memory of the bathhouse no longer felt heavy. It had become something else entirely. A reminder that fear often grows from distance and misunderstanding, while truth has a way of bringing people closer together even in the middle of war. Outside the camp, the Oklahoma fields stretched wide beneath the quiet stars while the wind continued its slow journey across the grass. Inside the fences, the prisoners and guards slept beneath the same sky, separated by duty and circumstance, yet sharing the same night, the same air, and the same simple human need for peace. And in the quiet center of the compound, the small wooden bathhouse stood exactly as it always had, unchanged and ordinary, a silent witness to the moment when fear had quietly stepped aside to make room for understanding.